Hey, Kathryn, welcome to the
Hey,
podcast.
thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to getting into what we're going to be discussing today because it is, we were just saying before I hit record, it's a fresh topic
Mhm.
for the show, and which is, after almost 500 episodes, that's saying something. And
Yeah.
it's a topic that I know is going to really resonate with so many listeners, and I'm super curious too because we're going to be talking about something that has impacted my life. And now I feel like I'm
Yeah.
talking around the issue, but before we get into it, take a few minutes and introduce yourself and tell us kind of about your work in the world and your why for what you do.
Absolutely. My name is Kathryn Hamlin-Pacheco. I am an occupational therapist. I should say I am privileged to be an occupational therapist. It is the most fun job. I am also an autism spectrum disorder clinical specialist, which feel just very privileged to hold because I get to work with, I get to work with my favorite people every day as I go into work, and it's quite an honor. I really work a lot with neuroscience. I love neuroscience. I think we're at this place that we're able to understand differences and strengths and challenges through a neuroscience perspective, and it's really helping us appreciate each other and support each other. And I find that the neuroscience is very intense. And so I spend a lot of time kind of looking through the neuroscience, learning about it. But before becoming an occupational therapist, I was a teacher. And so I still, I think, have this love of teaching. And so I've come to think of myself as a translator of neuroscience. I try to take the neuroscience that applies to whatever work I'm doing and translate it into everyday life for kids, for parents, for caregivers, for clinicians. So that's kind of where I am, and I hope to be able to do some of that today. And I also have to start this by saying that, I think the work that you're doing here on this podcast and with your program is so important because, like we were just saying before we hit record, the language has shifted so much in a positive direction. And I think that we're supporting each other better, we're understanding each other better, and we're moving past that acceptance to more of an appreciation. And I think that the work that you've done with this platform has just supported that shift so much. So it's truly an honor to be here in this
Hmm.
conversation.
It's so nice. Thank you. Thank you. I love that lens. And yeah, I just shared recently with my community the TEDx talk that I did in Berlin, which was specifically about this idea that the neuroscience is moving so quickly, right? And
Oh,
our
yes.
language is like trying to play catch up,
Yeah.
and then people's awareness and compassion and kind of integrating this kind of new
Hmm.
lens is also lagging behind. So it is a
Yeah.
very dynamic time in the neurodivergent space, and it's really
Yeah.
exciting to
It
see.
is.
So yeah,
Yes. Yes. And the growth that's happening. It's a good spot.
yeah, I agree. I agree. So okay, now that I've buried the lead, let's talk about the
But
topic for
wait, what are
today's
we
show.
talking about?
So you reached out to me over email and, suggested a conversation on clothing, sensory, kids getting dressed, and specifically tactile defensiveness, which is
Yes.
something that I learned about, when my kiddo was 5. Uh, yeah, must have been 5. That's when we started OT back in Seattle doing DIR floor time. And that was a whole new world for me. So we're
Mhm.
going to dive into tactile defensiveness today,
Yeah.
and clothing will go into that experience because that does impact so many listeners. So let's
Yeah.
start with the baseline definition. What is tactile defensiveness? How do you explain that to people?
Yes, and there's so many terms. The terminology with sensory integration and processing has kind of a history of being a bit confusing and overlapping. But that tactile defensiveness is one of the terms that I really appreciate because what I hope to share today is that for someone who is tactile defensive, so tactile is our sense of touch, how we determine that something is touching our skin and how we understand what's touching our skin. So that's the tactile part. And what we're going to see is that that defensive part is so important. So tactile defensiveness is when we see a child or a person kind of have a defensive response toward kind of everyday sensations that of things that are touching their skin. And so when we're talking about that, clothing is something that's so we all get dressed every day. And so that tactile defensiveness means that for this individual, the feelings that they're getting from their skin contacting the clothing might send them into a state of defensiveness. People may have also heard of sensory over responsive. That's a term that we've been using for a while and is used a lot in the literature. I am very, very careful to spell out when we're talking about sensory over responsiveness. We are not saying that the child or the individual is over responsive, because that is kind of have this negative feel. What we're saying is that their nervous system seems to over respond, and that affects them. And then some people might have heard of heightened defensiveness. We're kind of in this period where we're shifting from sensory over responsive to sensory heightened responsivity, to have a term that may be a bit more respectful for some. But we're talking about kids or individuals. I work a lot with kids, so I'm going to say, no matter how hard I try, I will say kids in this interview.
Mm-hmm.
But individuals who that feeling that they're getting from their clothing is setting off a defensive response.
That was such a good explanation. So thank you for breaking that down. And of course, as you're describing that, I am thinking of, how just the terms that you shared, there's a lot to unpack there.
Yes.
I had Carol Kronowitz, who, is kind of, I think, of the godmother of all things sensory processing differences, who wrote The Out of Sync Child, and recently that's been updated. But when she came to visit my community, she had shifted and now is talking about sensory processing differences and was very clear about using that language rather than sensory processing disorder. But even as you talk about the over responsiveness, and I even wonder if that word defensive, it's so fascinating how we could continue to kind of break things down.
Yes. And I hope to really pinpoint that this is truly a nervous system response. So one thing that I think, as an OT who works a lot in sensory integration, I love how much it's talked about. It's almost become popular, for lack of a better term. And there's so many benefits because we're so much more aware. But I do think kind of that growth in popularity has run out ahead of some of the science. So I think it's important to think about when we're talking about sensation. And if we're being specific to clothing, there's two big sensations I'd like to talk about. First is tactile, and then we can get to the other one. But if you think about your sense of touch, if I'm thinking about, how my sleeve feels on my arm or my pants feel on my legs, the fabric contacts my skin, which initiates a signal, which ultimately goes to my brain. So we are talking, this is neuroscience. And I think that's a really important dynamic that often people may miss. But this is really a whole internal nervous system response and organization of the information that we're getting from our senses.
Yeah. Yeah. I was, just thinking about the fact that, again, back in the day now, so this would have been, maybe 15 years ago that I was really exploring this, sensory processing differences were not really even legitimized in, in a lot of conversations, it was just like, that's just some woo-woo thing over there in the corner. It's not a real thing. So has that changed?
I think yes. And also I have to, say personally, so I was a teacher before becoming an OT, and I went to Virginia Commonwealth University, which has had some real heavy hitters in the sensory integrative world. And even going to VCU and even going through the program with such phenomenal faculty who knew so much about sensory integrative practice, I wasn't sure if I really believed in it, even at that point. I was like, I don't know. And it just didn't feel so concrete to me. But as often happens when we take our first job, it's kind of what you get. And my first job was in an SI clinic, and I thought, well, I'll learn a little and move on. And I've never moved on because it is so powerful. It's life changing. And I think there's this part too where not everyone has sensory processing challenges that interfere with their everyday life. And when we talk about that sensory processing dysfunction, what I think we're trying to say is that those sensory processing abilities don't function within this person's everyday life. It's not the person that's dysfunctional, but those skills don't support success in everyday life. But when we can reorganize how their brains and nervous systems understand these sensations, then we have this person who is so much more successful because life is full of sensation. And so, yes, I think it's changed so much because we see how powerful it is. And so that's just been really exciting.
Okay, so let's talk about then, you said we know so much more about neuroscience, and that's a special interest of yours in terms of really figuring out what's going on. So could you really explain to us what is happening and, tie in polyvagal? Because again, that's also something that really wasn't available to us in the same way, as it is today. So what is happening within a human, a child's nervous system when they are experiencing this distress?
Yes. And to do that, if I can, I'm going to back up a little bit. And can we introduce the two senses that I think are the key players?
Yeah,
okay.
Please.
So first is our tactile sensory system. That's just like we said, that sense of touch. So what's touching our skin, and all of that information is going to go up to our brain. And I think that one's really obvious when we talk about dressing, because we're talking about that clothing that's touching our skin. The other piece, though, that I think is so important is our interoceptive sense. And so interoception is kind of the newer kid on the block, if you will, if you've been thinking and talking about sensory processing integration. But what interoception is a sense that tells us about kind of how we are. A lot of it is thinking about that internal sense. So it does some basic things, like if I feel hungry, we have interoceptors internally that say, "Whew, I'm feeling hungry, I need to eat." Or if I need to relieve maybe my bladder, it's detectors on the inside of us that says, "Whoa, my bladder's full, I need to do something about that." But then it also says things like, "Ooh, I don't feel good." Like if you are getting sick, the day before you're getting sick, I don't feel good today. Well, we have receptors inside of us that tell us about how we're feeling. Or if we say, like, I feel really upset, and we have that internal distress, well, what's happening inside of us is that interoception. We're feeling it. And of course, we can talk about the positives. I feel really good. I feel calm. I feel connected. So the tactile system and the interoceptive system work really closely together. And for kind of a basic example of that is, if it is a Sunday morning and I woke up early and I'm going to read, and I have on, my softest pajamas, and I get my heavy weighted, soft, fuzzy blanket. That's all soft fabric that I'm going to get information from my tactile system. Maybe I get a warm cup of tea, and that warmth is from my tactile system. That all of that tactile information is going up into my brain, or toward my brain. But also those feelings of goodness, those are really connected with those sensations that I'm getting from that heavy blanket, from the soft fabric. Then if I'm sitting reading and I think, I feel something crawling up my back, if I feel something on my skin, on my back, that's tactile sensory information. Something's touching me. And what happens? Oh, I'm all of a sudden very alert. I'm jumping up. I'm brushing whatever it might be off. I'm in a heightened state of arousal. And so now internally, I do not feel good. I feel very distressed because of what I felt on my skin. And I think that those are good ways to explain how our tactile systems and our interoceptive systems work so closely together. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I love the way you're explaining this. Yeah, sorry.
I
Keep
love
going.
it. I'm not sure if it's hobby or work, but it's somewhere in the midst. So then if we're talking about dressing, we think about the clothing. And if we want to just go ahead and jump into that tactile defensive individual, for someone who the sensation of their clothing is uncomfortable, is it to the point of distress where they're getting those internal feelings of, I am not well? That tactile system is coming in together with their interoceptive system. And I think then we can layer on experience if we really want to nerd out on the neuroscience. So first, it might start with the sensation I get from my clothing is feeling in a way. I get that sensation in a way. My brain does not understand it. So our nervous systems want to understand things because once I understand it, okay, it's okay. If the nervous system isn't able to understand, process, integrate, use all of these words, the information coming from our skin, if it doesn't make sense, it's going to be alerting. Alerting is like, oof, I don't know if I like that. For some of us, then our nervous system can say, okay, maybe it's after the holidays. I ate too many cookies. My pants, they're kind of bothering me the way that they fit. They're a little tight. But I can kind of say, okay, it's not comfortable, but I'm okay. And I can keep doing what I need to do in everyday life and feel good. If that feeling is so uncomfortable that I start to get distressed, then we start to talk about those internal systems of distress. And once we're distressed, things feel worse and worse and worse. And I want to jump into that polyvagal lens. But even before then, if we think about, and I work in pediatrics, so forgive me, but if we use some of those examples with kids, then we get a child who's uncomfortable in their clothing. So then they don't want to get dressed because they have a history of clothing doesn't feel good. So then it's 7 a.m. and I don't want to get dressed. And then what might that look like? Are those defensive behaviors, like I might yell, I might fuss, I might tantrum, I might kick or hide. I'm just trying to protect myself. But to a parent who's trying to get out the door to go to work and go to school, we're all busy. If that looks like a tantrum, then what happens? Well, and I have to say this, I am a parent too. I am not a perfect parent. I love working with parents and parent coaching. So hear me out here. But if then the parent is busy and said, get dressed, just get dressed. And then it's more stressful. Then we're just co-escalating, right? Instead of co-regulating. And then that has a negative memory. And so then, we go on and layer these negative experiences associated with dressing. And what we get is this really strong model in the brain that says clothing is not good. It doesn't feel good. It's not good to get dressed. And then the brain expects it to not be good. And so we kind of get this whole model in the brain that clothing doesn't feel good. It's not good. And I'm upset. And so it kind of snowballs. Is that kind of a fair explanation?
Yeah, I hadn't thought of it that way, and that over time, these negative associations that extend beyond just the physical sensation, depending on how they're responded to by their parents or by others around them who aren't recognizing the connection between the clothing and their response, how it could reinforce that. I hadn't thought of it that way before. That's super interesting.
And we're always learning about sensations. That's kind of that principle. And I have to say again, this is not pinpointing anything that a parent may be doing wrong, because we're trying to understand, and we can only understand what has been explained to us. But I think that can end up as this big negative. And then if we bring in the polyvagal theory, that's, it's just transformed what we do. And I don't think we have time to go all the way through that, but I think you've got some other interviews that people can go back and explore. But from that lens, we have our neuroceptive sense. So Dr. Porges has developed that term. Neuroception says our nervous system below the level of consciousness is always monitoring and asking, am I safe or am I not? If I'm safe, I can be connected and engaged. I can feel well. If I'm not safe, I initially get that sympathetic nervous system response, which means you mobilize and defend. So this, most people I think are familiar with fight or flight. So if my nervous system says something's not safe, I go into a fight or flight response. Again, does this look like the child who's tantruming, who might, maybe kick or run or scream or yell when it's time to get dressed, or maybe when they've been wearing clothing all day and they're tired from those sensations. They don't feel safe in those pieces of clothing that they're wearing. And then also, can it escalate into that shutdown? So when a threat is so much that fight or flight response doesn't work, eventually we may get to a point where we just shut down. We kind of give up. And so, if then we think about this child in clothing through that lens, then we can go beyond just trying to think about how do we change the clothing. That's where we get the tagless clothing, the seamless clothing, all of those kind of supports, which certainly have a place. But also we need to reconstruct this child's understanding of that tactile sensation that they're getting and the feelings, that those emotional based feelings and responses from the clothing. And that, I think, is where we see the big response. And that's why I love understanding it this way, because only once we understand that, then can we say, oh, now I know how to support this kid or individual.
Yeah. Okay. Wow. Super fascinating. So I want to get more into what you just kind of teased before the break of, where the real power is here in helping our kids reorganize their brain and kind of navigate this in a way that's not just, for lack of a better word, putting a Band-Aid on by like changing the clothes. But I do want to, if you don't mind, just in case listeners this might be a new concept for them. And here's my little like sidebar to this conversation. With my own kiddo, I did not know that this was an issue at all. And it was through OT that tactile defensiveness, the OT we were working with brought it up. And I was like, oh, so interesting. And she showed in the context of shaving cream, for example, and then, I was like, yeah, actually, mud and having stuff, on my kids' hands was really distressing. And I started to put it together, but I wasn't plugged into the clothing experience. So could you just give a couple examples of the types of things that you've seen, the types of like clothing experiences that, you mentioned a tag, but that could be distressing, just so listeners have those examples.
Yes. And thank you for asking that, because sometimes when you do it every day, you kind of jump over those pieces. I have seen, can I just give some examples about what I've seen in practice, and then we can continue to clarify?
Yeah.
So I've had kids come in who may have two outfits that they can wear and feel good in. So these kids might be wearing the same outfit to school every day. And the parents that are trying to bring them shopping, try different fabrics, nothing feels good. It's only these two. It might be flip-flops and a t-shirt, but they might live in New York in the winter. I've had kids who want to go see Christmas lights with their family, but it's really cold and they just couldn't put on the warm coat, the warm shoes. So they couldn't go with their family to see that holiday light experience. I've had parents who are washing clothes every night, but also they're worried about, what are my child's peers going to start thinking if they're wearing the same clothes day after day? I've had parents who I say, ooh, you must be doing a lot of laundry and washing the same outfit every night. And they say, no, my child's so sensitive that after I wash it, the clothing feels different. So they have a meltdown if I wash it. So now they wear the same thing every night, and I don't wash that. I've had kids who want to do extracurriculars, dancing, soccer, performance like plays, musicals, but can't wear the uniform or costume. So they can't do those things. And we know once we start talking about peer interactions, extracurriculars, we're talking about holistic well-being and development. I've had kids who can't go to sleepovers because for them to sleep. They can't sleep with clothes on. And, when you're 12, you can't go to a sleepover and sleep naked. And the parents are saying, I don't understand. I don't know how to support. So those are kind of the kids that I started seeing. And I thought this was so interesting that honestly, that's what made me really jump into this science. That's what made me say, like, wow, something is going on here.
That was super helpful. Yeah. And, I'll add one more that I've seen is just needing really tight clothing, right?
Yes.
Like needing to be just almost, in a vacuum sealed in
Right.
clothes can be very like comforting, right?
Right. Trying to find that comfort. And that's why another reason why I really love Dr. Porges' polyvagal theory is because he says that it helps us reconceptualize some of those behaviors and responsive that we would have said, that's maladaptive. Those are tantrums. That's negative behaviors. When we see that this child's in fight or flight, we see that those are actually valiant attempts to understand what's going on and keep going. And clothing is hard because we almost every day have to get dressed at some point. And that's one of the things that I think makes this so complicated.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Super fascinating. So let's pivot then and spend some time talking about how parents and caregivers can support their kids. What are some of the best practices and how do you work with families?
Yes, what can we do? And I think all of that understanding just leads up to that. So the first thing that I encourage families to do is just to understand it on this level. So whether you find an OT, whether you find your resources, to really understand what's happening on that nervous system level. And then I think probably one of the most effective ways we can support is through that co-regulation, that felt safety with a polyvagal lens. So I understand, dressing is hard for you. I am here with you. I'm going to bring my voice, I'm going to lower my voice, slow down my movements, give a positive affect. And that can be hard. And again, I want to give a shout out to the parents. When we're on our way to work and to school and we're busy and we have 2 other kids and everybody's upset, it's not easy to slow down and connect here with a child who's struggling with this. But I think it's really interesting to compare and contrast like escalating versus co-regulating. So I might have to wake up a little bit early. I might have to find a quiet room to get dressed. I might have to take this slow. I might have to practice in the afternoons. So kind of trying to find that place where we have felt safety with dressing. The other thing that I might need to do is control some of those other elements. So if it's a child who has difficulty dressing, I might need to not have all the music on. I might need to find a place where the siblings aren't there for a moment. And we might need to practice this. So I encourage families to find times where you don't have to get the clothes on to get out the door to practice wearing clothing. Do it on a Saturday, do it in the afternoon. Because what I really want to get to, and I talk so much about play, can we play with the clothing? Can we wear it in a meaningful way? Because the brain wants to understand it, and we almost just need to give it an opportunity to. And here's kind of the last heavy hitting neuroscience I'll offer. And then we'll say like, oh, that's enough for one podcast. But if we think about, I think people are really familiar with kind of that triune brain model where we have the lower level reptilian brain, then we have the emotional brain, and then we have that higher level thinking brain. And we used to think that those were a strict hierarchy, like the bottom reptilian brain, basic, had to work to enable the emotional, to enable the higher level thinking. And that is not exact. It's not strictly hierarchical. Is that the right? I think I might have done that a little bit wrong, but
I do that all the time.
Okay.
Yeah, it's
fine. It's not fully a hierarchy. How about that? But they are interconnected. And so if you'll think about it this way, that autonomic nervous system, that felt safety response from that polyvagal lens lives in that lower level brain. It's underneath conscious. That felt safety is a very basic kind of neural process. When we feel safe, then we can experience our emotions differently or in a more informed way. We can really experience them, and then we can use that higher level thinking. So it does build as kind of the foundation of a house, to the walls, to the roof. Now here's where, when I got to this blew my mind, and it still does every single time I say this. This is big neuroscience, primary somatosensory cortex, the primary part in your brain that is going to process, understand, interpret your tactile, the touch information that you're getting, that lives in your cortex, which is your higher level brain. So if I have a child that clothing causes a fight or flight response in the lower level brain, what I know is that their higher level brain, where that tactile information needs to get for the brain to understand it, it's not working very well. It almost kind of stops at a lower level, if you will. When I start to support felt safety, regulation, we're connecting, when I can support those more positive emotions, I give the green light to their higher level cortex. And that's where that tactile information needs to get for the brain to figure out what that sensation of from the clothing means, to understand it. And once it understands it, it can use it and integrate it into everyday life. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I have a follow-up question.
Yes, yeah.
So my follow-up question is, just to clarify, you're saying that when you can regulate and connect with a child while they are playing with or experiencing a tactile sensation that may in another circumstance push them into fight or flight, but you're creating positive associations with it by connecting and co-regulating, and that's how the brain gets rewired. Did I get that right?
Yes, exactly. And it's like, to me, it's like it almost, once, if we're in fight or flight, that tactile information gets kind of stuck at the lower levels. Not that it doesn't travel all the way up to the cortex, not that it's not there at all, but not in a way that the brain can really work to understand it. So if through co-regulation, through understanding how to manage this child's or support this child's positive emotions, being able to be there and be present, it's almost like the feeling that they get from their clothing gets to the part of the brain that can understand it for the first time, and then they can understand it. And once we understand it, this child may always have sensory preferences. And that's where we can talk about, everyone has sensory preferences. But, I can say, I will not wear anything wool. It bothers me. It is itchy. I refuse to wear wool, but I can also live a life that feels good to me and is successful. And I can do everything that I need and want to do without wearing wool. That's a preference that's pretty functional. So not that these kids may not always have strong preferences, but can they then do the things that are meaningful, that they want to do, that they need to do? That's the goal here. The goal is the child. Does that make sense?
Yeah, 100%. So what I'm hoping you can do is walk us through an example of what this looks like, even this kind of co-regulation or connection with a child. And, just so we can kind of envision how you actually do this work, because parents might explore doing this with their own child as well.
Yes, absolutely. And so, this is so individualized, but we can still give, I think, a cohesive example to put all the information together. So if I have a child who comes in and has those characteristics of tactile defensiveness, the first thing that I do is work to connect with the child. So that's that co-regulation connection, and find what feels good to them. So when I talk about co-regulation from that polyvagal lens, when I go into the room, I'm going to sit on the floor, make myself small to connect, even if it's a teenager, because I don't want to be this adult that comes in over top of them. So I sit on the floor, and I think in our busy world, this can be hard, but I really challenge myself to where everything else is gone and I'm just here with you today, because that helps me connect. I slow down. I find that prosody of voice where I'm, having that melodic tone. It's softer. I soften my face. I soften my body. This is all polyvagal theory. So if you want to know more about that, there's so much information. So I kind of offer this space to connect. The other thing that I do is there's ways to use sensory information to help calm, regulate, engage. There's a lot of words we can use there, but often like slow, rhythmic information, predictable sensory information, all of these pieces can help. So I really spend time with this child figuring out, how can we regulate together? Because first I need to know how you regulate. How can I help you? Then we'll introduce clothing, and I do it in a very play-based model, or with older kids, we have to adjust it so it feels, appropriate to them. But we may dance with clothing. We may try on clothing. We may put on mom's clothing. We may dress mom. We may dress dad. We may dress, mom with dad's clothing. We may put on something. We do this whole engaging play because by the definition of play, if you're playing, you're fully engaged and you're connected. So there in play, I know that this brain is ready to learn. And it's kind of a dance with how much the child can do, because I want to play. We also kind of push to the edge of our abilities. So can you put the shirt over your arm and swing it around? If, for some of our kids, it's just like, can I see a shirt and not feel intense distress? That's a win. Then maybe next time they'll put it on. Mm-hmm. And in a way, I think it's similar to some like the SOS feeding approach, which anytime I mention that approach, I have to say, I'm not certified through that approach. They have worked so hard to develop and with kind of maintain the integrity of that model. I want to be very careful how I share that information, but they've done this incredible work with getting picky eaters familiar with eating, and that, you play with the food, you engage with the food, and you build those positive models. And I think about that sometimes with clothing. And as that child's engaging in a positive way, their brain's ready to learn about that clothing, and they're building a more positive mental understanding of that clothing. And that's my building blocks. And we slowly, kind of increase that. And I have found, here's where I love science, and then I kind of jump away from the science and say, it's so interesting because I always tell parents, hang with me here, because I understand, like, what does putting a shirt over your arm and swinging it around, or, putting a tutu on your head have to do with wearing a school uniform on Tuesday? Hang with me here, because there's some magic that happens that once we kind of flip the script and have some positives with dressing, the child is able to understand it. And I can't explain this other than it seems to be like they make these leaps that you don't even expect. You're like, oh man, I thought that was going to be months down the road. And all of a sudden they did what? And so kind of we're there with them, and we're there for the ups and the downs. Here's another place where I love to explain neuroscience to kids. And so sometimes when it's developmentally appropriate, we have this conversation with them. Like, you're having a fight or flight response. How can we help you feel good? And that's kind of what it looks like in practice. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, this is super, super helpful. So yeah, I just really appreciate the way you explain things in a way that I understand them in a new way. So I appreciate that. Thank you. And I hope the same is true for my listeners. Yeah.
Yeah.
So let me, as a way to kind of wrap up, I think, we might have to have you back to explore this more deeply, because I think there's so much that we could still get into. But
yeah,
I'm thinking about for listeners who are kind of connecting some dots and listening to this, and they want to just be more curious about what might be going on with their kid's nervous system when it comes to this tactile responsiveness. What's something you would encourage them to just, get curious about or pay attention to, or something that they can explore further after listening to this episode?
Yeah, I would say be an observer of your child. See what are they doing when it gets time, or when it comes time to get dressed or around clothing. See if that part of, are they moving into fight or flight or shutdown? Does that resonate? And then try some of those co-regulatory practices. So the very basics that are the strongest: get small, slow down, relax your voice and your face, and kind of approach it from a different perspective and see what changes you might see in your child. And here's where, I have never done that and 5 minutes later have a child who's like, oh yes, I can wear anything. But you find the small changes, and you see how then you can grow, because it's all about growth. And we are actually restructuring the brain. We're actually helping these kids learn about clothing in a completely different way, because before they saw clothing and it was immediate bad, immediate distress. We're trying to start charting the way towards like clothing. Maybe I'm curious. Maybe I'm interested. Maybe I'm not full distress. Maybe I'm uncertain. And try to kind of create those opportunities. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, I just want to let listeners know too, a couple of episodes that if this is newer information for you and you want to explore it further, go to the show notes page for this episode, which will be on Tilt Parenting under the podcast, and you find this episode. I will have links to the conversation I had with Carol Kronowitz about sensory processing differences. I will have a link to my episode with Deb Dana, where she really kind of breaks down polyvagal for us. She's also an interpreter. Oh, she's so good. Yeah. An interpreter of polyvagal. And then I'll also have a link to the episode I did with Dr. Stephen Porges and Karen Anderko about polyvagal and the Safe and Sound protocol. So there's a lot you can dive into just here on Tilt, and then there'll be other places to explore. And speaking of that, Kathryn, can you let us know what resources you have available and where you would like listeners to connect with your work?
Yes, please. So my website is brainexecutiveprogram.com. And I do right now have a course up for parents and caregivers about this dressing topic. January, crossing fingers, 2026, I'll be opening my clinical course on that. So if you're an OT or some type of clinician and you want to go really deep into the neuroscience, I'll have that course opening. And I try to keep my courses very cost effective, because we're all trying in this world. I do have a free ebook on dressing that goes through, when I think about supporting a child in dressing, I have kind of 8 approaches. And so I have an ebook that walks you through each of those approaches. And what we've talked about today is all within that. So if you're a reader, you can print that off or download it and read it. I have an Instagram, and that I'm always trying to share information with. But then also, if you go to my website, you can just send me an email. I love what I do. I love the kids and families I work with. And sensory health is health. And if you have a question that wasn't answered or you don't know where to start, please send an email, because we can at least help connect the dots for you so that you know where to go. And your local occupational therapist, you can just internet search pediatric occupational therapist sensory integration and see, make that call and connect, because that can also be, that one-on-one resource that you might need.
Yeah. Fantastic. Okay, listeners, you heard that there's going to be a lot in the show notes page. So definitely check those out. And Kathryn, I'm really happy that you reached out to me. I was fascinated by this, and I know this is going to be such a useful resource, and hope probably one of those episodes that people take notes or go back and listen to again, because there was a lot of really helpful insights in there and strategies. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It was so much fun. I enjoyed it. And thanks again for the work you're doing.
Thank you.